If movies taught you anything about medieval warfare, it's this: a towering castle, a heroic charge, ladders on the wall, and everything is decided in one explosive afternoon. But the truth is way less cinematic and far more miserable. Because most of the time, medieval wars weren't decided by one glorious battle. They were decided by waiting, outside stone walls, day after day, while hunger, sickness, weather, and fear did the real damage. Today, we're stepping into a medieval siege as it really was. The boredom, the engineering, the ugly logistics, the psychology, and the brutal reason castles usually fell, not from one big assault, but from everything happening around the walls. Number 1. Why sieges were normal. A medieval siege usually wasn't the dramatic one big afternoon that movies love. It was the default way to take territory because it controlled the thing rulers actually cared about: places. An open field battle could flip a war in a few hours, and that sounds exciting until you remember what it meant for a commander. Lose once, and you didn't just lose soldiers. You lost nobles who mattered politically, horses you couldn't replace quickly, banners that held the army together, and maybe your own freedom if you got captured. Even a strong army could crumble fast if the line broke or the leadership got taken. That risk made people cautious. So instead of gambling everything on one fight, they often tried to force the enemy into a slow problem they couldn't dodge, living behind walls while the outside world got cut off. Castles and walled towns weren't just cool buildings. They were the hard points that held a region together. They guarded bridges, roads, river crossings, mountain passes, and ports. They protected food stores and the local money flow because taxes and tolls only meant something if you could enforce them. They also worked as intimidation machines. Even if you hated the local lord, you might not rebel if a stone fortress sat within riding distance. Taking land meant taking those nodes. You could beat an enemy army and still lose the war if the enemy's castles stayed active behind you, raiding your supply line and giving their allies a place to regroup. That's why sieges happened so often. They were slow, expensive, and miserable, but they were predictable compared to a pitched battle. Predictable didn't mean easy. It meant the problem shifted from who hits harder today to who can keep their system running longer. Food, water, pay, discipline, engineering, weather, sickness, morale, politics, allies showing up late or not at all. Those were the real weapons. Once you start thinking that way, a siege stops looking like an action sequence and starts looking like a test of organization under stress. And that's a much closer match to what people actually experienced. Number 2, getting there alive. A siege didn't begin at the wall. It began the moment an army tried to move and stay together for more than a few days. Medieval armies weren't modern supply chains with neat boxes and fixed schedules. They were a traveling town made out of people, animals, carts, tools, and arguments. If you had cavalry, knights, men-at-arms, mounted sergeants, you had the extra problem that horses eat constantly. A horse isn't a motorcycle you can park and forget. It needs fodder every day, and quality matters. If the grazing is poor, or the grain runs short, the horse weakens, and then the elite part of your army starts losing the edge it's built on. Roads were another issue. A lot of routes were basically dirt tracks. In good weather, you could move wagons. In bad weather, those same wagons became anchors. Mud swallowed wheels, bridges failed, and rivers that looked manageable turned dangerous after rain. Even when the road held, carts broke. Axles cracked, leather straps snapped, and a single failure could jam a column for hours. Every delay mattered because the army was eating as it moved. So commanders leaned hard on two options: bring supplies or take supplies. Bringing supplies meant wagons, pack animals, and planning, and it still wasn't enough for long. Taking supplies meant foraging and seizure, which sounds clean when you call it living off the land. But in practice it meant pressure on local villages and farms. Grain, livestock, firewood, and beer or wine weren't extras, they were survival. Clean water was always a headache, and in some areas it was the headache. People got sick fast from bad water, and once sickness starts moving through a crowded group, you don't get to pause the campaign and recover. There's also a timing problem that modern viewers often miss. Medieval obligations and contracts could limit how long troops were expected to serve. Some forces were raised through feudal duty for a set period, and even paid troops still expected money, loot, or both. The longer the campaign went, the more it turned into a math problem. Can you keep paying? Can you keep feeding? Can you keep everyone from drifting away? The siege target knew all of this. Defenders weren't just hoping their walls held. They were hoping your system cracked first, before you got comfortable enough outside their gate to make the place truly feel trapped. Number 3. Building the siege world. Once the army arrived, the first battle was usually construction. If you picture attackers running straight at the walls, you're skipping the part that made a long siege even possible, creating a protected base that could survive weeks or months. A serious besieging force needed somewhere to sleep, somewhere to store food, somewhere to keep horses, somewhere for craftsmen to work, and some way to stop the defenders from doing quick raids that set everything on fire at 2 a.m. That's why you see earthworks and wood everywhere in real siege accounts. Ditches, banks, palisades, and guarded entrances weren't fancy, but they mattered. Earth is cheap and fast. A ditch slows a sudden rush. A raised bank gives you a better view and a safer firing position. A wooden fence isn't a castle wall, but it's enough to force an attacker to bunch up and lose speed. Many siege camps ended up looking like rough fortresses, and in a long operation, you might see something close to a ring, defenses facing the besieged place, and sometimes a second layer facing outward in case a relief army showed up. And then there's the least glamorous detail that still decided outcomes: sanitation. Thousands of people in one area produce waste, and waste attracts disease. If latrines are too close to water, the camp gets sick. If the water source is limited, people get desperate and take risks. If it rains for days and the ground becomes a swamp, feet rot, clothes never dry, and minor injuries turn into serious problems. Medieval medicine couldn't reliably stop infections, so small issues stacked up. That's one reason commanders enforced rules in camp. They weren't just being strict for pride. They were trying to keep the whole machine from collapsing because a few hundred people got sloppy. Daily life outside the walls could be mind-numbing. Guard rotations, hauling wood, repairing wagons, collecting water, digging trenches, watching the gate, listening for alarms, counting supplies, arguing over who owes what. This was the rhythm. People imagine sieges as constant violence, but a lot of it was routine labor with the stress dial turned up. You might go a week with nothing but distant arrows and occasional shouting, and then suddenly a night raid hits a worksite and everything turns into chaos for 20 minutes. That unpredictability is part of what made sieges mentally exhausting. Number 4. Cutting the world off. A siege didn't have to destroy walls to win. Often the main goal was simpler: stop the place from functioning. That means controlling movement, roads, paths, river access, gates, postern doors, and any route that could bring in food or carry out messages. If defenders could slip messengers out, they could call allies. If they could move small boats at night, they might keep supplies coming. If they could drive cattle into the fortress before the ring tightened, they bought themselves time. Attackers responded by turning the area around the target into a patrol zone. Watch posts went up. Scouts rode out. Work parties cleared trees and brush that could hide a sortie. Bridges and fords got guarded. Sometimes attackers built small strong points, temporary forts, towers, or walled enclosures on key approaches. That wasn't overkill, it was insurance. If a relief force arrived, you didn't want to fight while your camp was scattered and your engines were exposed. This is where siege warfare starts to look like a slow chess game. Defenders might try to break the blockade with sudden attacks, hitting the weakest link in the ring, burning supplies, or destroying a bridge the attackers need. Attackers might try to intercept messages, bribe locals for information, or force nearby settlements into cooperation so the defenders couldn't rely on them. Water could be decisive. Some castles had wells inside the walls, sometimes dug deep into rock, and that made them much harder to starve out. Others relied on cisterns or nearby streams, and those could be targeted. But even water wasn't always a clean win for either side. Poisoning sources gets talked about a lot in pop culture. In reality, it's complicated and risky, and it could backfire if your own forces end up using the same water. More often, the struggle was about access and control, not dramatic tricks. Who can safely reach the stream? Who controls the riverbank? Who can repair a damaged conduit? As the blockade tightened, the pressure inside the walls changed. It wasn't just hunger, it was uncertainty. When food is limited, every rumor matters. Relief is coming next week. The king has abandoned us. Someone opened a gate. Someone is hiding grain. People's behavior shifts when they feel trapped, and commanders on both sides understood that. Sometimes the most effective siege weapon was simply being present every day, making the defenders wake up to the same fact. The enemy is still there, still organized, still working, and time is moving in only one direction. Number 5. Engines and breaking walls. Siege engines weren't movie superweapons. They were tools that helped a larger plan, and their power depended on time, materials, and protection. A trebuchet or other stone-throwing machine can look unstoppable on paper, but building one needed skilled labor, quality timber, rope, and space. Operating it needed trained crews and steady routines. You also needed to place it where it could work without being burned, shot up, or sabotaged. Defenders didn't just stand on the wall and watch politely. They fired back with bows and crossbows. They sent out sorties to torch equipment. They reinforced damaged sections at night. They used screens, shields, and sometimes their own engines to harass crews. Also, walls are tougher than people assume. Medieval stone walls weren't always meant to be blown apart, because before late medieval gunpowder artillery, that kind of fast destruction was hard. Stones from engines could chip, crack, and slowly weaken masonry, especially if you could hit the same spot again and again. But defenders could patch with rubble, timber bracing, and earth packing. A wall that looked damaged from far away might still hold long enough to force attackers into a different method. That's why attackers mixed approaches. You might bombard to keep defenders tired and nervous, while also digging to undermine foundations. Undermining, sometimes called mining or sapping, was a brutal, technical process. You dig a tunnel toward the wall, support it with wooden beams, and then remove or burn those supports so a section of wall collapses. Defenders could respond by digging counter-tunnels, listening for noise, and trying to intercept. This turns into underground guesswork, with sound and intuition playing a big role. It was dangerous work even without enemy action, because tunnels collapse, air gets bad, and mistakes kill crews. Then there were direct assault tools, ladders, siege towers, and battering rams. Ladders were risky because the moment you put one up, defenders focus everything on that point. Siege towers could help, but they were huge targets and took a lot of wood and time. Rams worked best against gates or weaker sections, and gates were designed to resist them. Thick timber, iron fittings, and defenders above dropping stones or shooting down into the approach. Attackers used covered shelters, basically rolling roofs, to protect crews as they worked close to the wall. None of this was fast. It was problem-solving under fire. By the late Middle Ages, gunpowder artillery changes the conversation. Early cannons were inconsistent and expensive, but over time they got better at smashing specific points, especially when you could bring heavier guns and enough powder and shot. Even then, it didn't instantly make castles useless. It shifted design toward thicker, lower walls and better angles, and it changed what safe behind stone really meant. In the period when both old and new technologies overlapped, sieges could be a messy blend. Stone engines still used for intimidation or harassment, mining still relevant, and cannons slowly becoming the wall breakers everyone feared. Number 6. Life behind the walls. Inside the besieged place, life wasn't heroic, it was cramped and tense. If it was a castle with a small garrison, you still had the problem of space, sleep, and constant readiness. If it was a walled town, add civilians, families, craftsmen, servants, clergy, traders, and now every ration decision becomes political. A commander might want to conserve food for soldiers, but starving the civilian population could trigger panic, unrest, or betrayal. At the same time, feeding everyone equally might mean running out too early and losing the place anyway. Rationing sounds straightforward until you remember medieval storage isn't perfect. Grain can spoil, salt meat doesn't last forever, water storage can fail, firewood runs short. Animals inside the walls are both food and a burden because they also eat. Even if the stores are solid, distribution can become a problem. People hide food. People steal. People argue about fairness. The more pressure builds, the more discipline matters, and discipline isn't free. It takes leadership, trusted officers, and credible punishment. Defenders also had to work constantly. Walls get damaged and need repair. Arrow loops and wooden hoardings need upkeep. Watch shifts have to run day and night. Someone has to spot tunnels, watch for ladders, and listen for work outside the walls. One of the most stressful parts was not knowing which threat is real. The attackers might roll an engine forward as a feint. They might test defenses to see who responds slowly. They might fire a few shots not to destroy anything, but to keep everyone awake. Sleep deprivation is a weapon when people can't relax for weeks. Communication was a lifeline. If defenders could send messages out, everything changed. A promise of relief can keep morale up. Silence can crush it. Getting a messenger through a siege ring could mean slipping out a postern door at night, swimming a moat, disguising yourself, or using knowledge of local terrain. Attackers knew this and tried to tighten control, but no blockade is perfect. That's why sieges often had an element of cat and mouse that doesn't show on screen. The most important action might be one rider getting through, not a ladder hitting stone. And then there's the psychological grind of sound. You hear chopping as attackers build works. You hear hammering as they assemble machines. You hear shouted orders, horns, the creak of ropes, the thud of stones. Even when nothing happens, it feels like something is always about to happen, and living in that state changes people. Some get sharper, some break down, some get reckless. A siege tests the mind as much as the wall. Number 7. The hidden fighting. A siege can look static from a distance, but close up it's full of small violence and constant risk. Skirmishes happen around work parties, patrol routes, and supply runs. Defenders might rush out suddenly to burn a partially built tower or destroy a trench line before it's finished. Attackers might ambush anyone trying to bring in food or smuggle out messages. These clashes are usually short, fast, and confusing, not heroic duels. The goal is to cause damage and get back behind protection before the other side can respond in force. Night work was common because it reduced exposure. Attackers might dig or move materials after dark. Defenders might repair damaged sections under cover of night. That creates a weird rhythm where the quiet hours are actually busy, just less visible. It also raises the chance of accidents. People trip, tools break, fire spreads, and confusion leads to friendly fire. Medieval warfare has a lot of unplanned misery. You don't need a dramatic set piece when a rainstorm ruins bowstrings, soaks clothing, and turns a ditch into a hazard that people fall into while carrying heavy loads. Disease was a constant threat on both sides. Crowded conditions, stress, poor diet, and bad water are a perfect mix for sickness. If an illness moves through a camp, it doesn't care which side you're on. It reduces manpower, slows work, and makes people irritable and careless. Even when an army had enough food overall, the lack of variety could weaken people over time. Add cold nights, wet clothing, and exhaustion, and you get an army that looks strong on paper, but is quietly losing its ability to do hard work. Morale was shaped by small things. Can you keep bread coming? Can you keep pay coming? Can you keep order without turning the camp into a prison? Do people believe their leaders know what they're doing? Because a siege is full of waiting, and waiting gives fear room to grow. A sudden rumor. A relief army is coming. The Lord has cut a deal. We're running out of arrows. The tunnel was found, can move through a camp faster than any official message. Good commanders managed information as carefully as they managed food. Even armor, which looks so solid in documentaries, has a daily life cost. Plate armor is effective, but it's heavy, hot in summer, cold in winter, and it needs maintenance. Mail rusts. Leather dries out. Straps break. A soldier who can't keep gear functional becomes a liability. So a siege includes a lot of repair work: sharpening, patching, fletching arrows, fixing shields, maintaining bows, replacing broken spear shafts. The action is often a workshop problem. If your craftsmen are good and your supplies are steady, you become harder to break. If they aren't, you slowly fall apart even before anyone touches the wall. Number 8. How sieges really ended. People like to imagine sieges ending with a final storming of the breach, but a lot of them ended with talking, because talking was cheaper than forcing it. Assaults were terrifying and unpredictable. Attackers might lose a huge chunk of their men in minutes if the defenders were prepared and the approach was narrow. Defenders knew that once a wall or gate truly failed, control could slip fast, and then everything depends on discipline in the worst moment possible. That mutual fear created space for negotiation. Terms could be surprisingly structured. Sometimes a garrison surrendered and was allowed to march out with weapons, banners, or at least personal belongings, depending on the agreement and the reputations involved. Sometimes hostages were exchanged to guarantee the deal. Sometimes a deadline was set. Surrender by a certain day, and you get decent terms. Hold out past that, and the terms worsen. It's harsh, but it's also practical. Commanders used incentives to avoid a costly last push. Politics could flip a siege overnight. A relief army might appear and force the attackers to withdraw. A local noble might switch sides. A king might redirect resources to a different front. Money mattered too. Mercenaries might demand back pay. Allies might argue over who gets what if the place falls. Sometimes bribery and betrayal did what engines couldn't. A gate opened at the wrong time, a key person changed loyalty, or a faction inside decided they'd rather cut a deal than starve. That's not less medieval. It's extremely medieval. Power was personal, and loyalty had limits. When an assault did happen, it was often after long pressure had already done most of the work. A wall section is weakened, defenders are exhausted, supplies are thin, and confidence is cracking. At that point, the attackers are not betting on heroics. They're betting that the defenders can't respond with the same energy they had weeks earlier. Even then, a failed assault could end the whole campaign if the attackers took too many losses or morale dropped. And after a surrender or capture, the place still had to be controlled. Someone had to garrison it, repair damage, restore food storage, and manage the local population. A captured castle that can't be held is just a stone trophy. That's why sieges weren't isolated events. They were part of a larger struggle of administration and resources, where the real question wasn't just, can you take it? But can you keep it running while the next problem is already forming on the horizon?